So I'm now going to look at grouping. Grouping is a version of price discrimination that is of particular relevance, of course, to applications on the internet. What happens under grouping is that the seller can actually observe consumer characteristics and then can take those observations and set a price for each different characteristic. The questions are, when do characteristics matter for pricing? If they don't matter, why bother grouping? First condition for that is you have to have an incentive to do so, from the seller's point of view. Different groups have different price elasticities. If they have different price elasticities, it is generally known in economics that you can profit by pricing at different levels for each particular group. You also have to, as a seller, be able to set different prices for different groups. What that generally means is that trade between the groups is difficult. If one group who's being charged a low price can buy goods and then sell them to the group being charged a high price, then this will undermine the seller's ability to practice grouping. To see how grouping works, consider a normal demand curve like this, where you could send a single price to all consumers. Under grouping, we separate out the consumers into two different groups. If we could set the same price to both of those groups, which would be a situation like this, but in actuality, what we want to do is set a higher price for the group that is less price sensitive. That's the group on the right. By doing this, we sacrifice very few sales from the group on the right, but by dropping price to the group on the left, we can increase sales by a lot. Overall, that means more revenue for the seller. What are some examples of grouping? One example that is quite prominent is student discounts. This is where some companies charge a lower price to consumers who are students. Why? Because they are the more price elastic or price sensitive consumers relative to the rest of the population. We also see the same thing for senior citizen discounts. Senior citizens often get discounts. Why? Perhaps, I guess, they have more time on their hands to search for lower prices. Perhaps they're more sensitive to price increases because they could recall times when prices were lower. It's harder to see why, but they're quite pervasive. International pricing. Often it's the case that companies price higher, generally outside of the US, than they do inside. For an iPad, for instance, here's from a few years ago, but it's pretty much the same. The price, and this is not taking into account things like tax, which would only make it worse, is higher in Canada than, say, it is in the US. Now, what this would reflect is the notion that the price elasticity of demand is actually more price elastic in the US than in Canada and elsewhere. Sometimes this is supposed to be related to income, but generally we do not think of the US as the poorer country, so this has often been a puzzle. You might be able to think of some other examples. Grouping is not something that is necessarily easy to achieve from a business point of view. It can have some pitfalls. For instance, it can create customer resentment. Amazon tried to work out a grouping strategy based on different visitors to its site. And it experimented, for instance, with different prices for DVDs. Well, this being the internet, even as early as 1999 when this was done, people discovered that, and you could see it created resentment against calls that Amazon were being unfair. It subsequently had to make that practice, well, far more hidden. You can also have arbitrage, again, which can unravel grouping. If you try to charge high prices in Canada and low prices in the US, someone might find a way of shipping items across the border. Grouping might be hard to implement. It might be actually hard to check and verify whether different consumers are of one group or another. For instance, to charge students a lower price, you have to have a student ID. That creates costs. Finally, there might be issues of morality. Ayres and Segelman in 1995 found that white males were quoted significantly lower prices than black or female buyers. Now these are different groups because they're observable to the seller, but the morality of charging different prices based on group characteristics like this is surely in question.